going to tell a story about not one of my proudest moments. In 1974, my ex-wife and I were living in Maine, and in a tent. And I wrangled a job, finagled a job with the town of Southwest Harbor as their Director of Conservation, which was a title we made up. And Southwest Harbor is on the southwest side of the Mount Desert Island, where the Acadia National Park is. The woman who hired me was LaRue Spiker. And LaRue Spiker was one of the grandest people I ever met. She was a former suffragette. She was a lifelong campaigner for women's rights. She was a lifelong campaigner for the environment. She wrote bi-weekly articles on the environment for the Ellsworth American and weekly articles, same, for the Bar Harbor Times. There were several environmental issues on Mount Desert Island that she'd been campaigning on for years. She created the Conservation Committee so I could be the Director of Conservation and work for her. I was very much in love with LaRue. She was just darling. But there was this thing going on in town that bothered me, because people referred to her as that queer old LaRue Spiker from away. And one day we were sitting in her little cabin, and I said, LaRue, do you know that they call you that? They call you that queer old LaRue Spiker from away? And she said, oh yes. And I said, does it bother you? And she said, no, that's just the way Mainers are. You just have to let it go. And then she said, did you know that they call you and your wife that queer young couple from away? And I said, no. And she said, well, they do. And I said, well, I guess I could just let it go. But there were several other people in town. There were a bunch of other people in town, maybe 4, 5, that were known as that queer so-and-so from away, and everybody knew them that way. And the most prominent of them, the most remarkable of them, was a woman known as that queer old cat lady from away. And she was a little, slender, bent-over lady who hobbled around town with her head and shoulders draped in black lace. And she spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her. She had a Victorian mansion down on the South Shore, and across the street was a replica of that mansion, quarter scale, I think, about the size of a shed. Both run down, both peel and paint, both boards falling off and eaves drooping, and both houses dripping with cats. There were cats all over the roofs, all over the porches, all over the windowsills. It was not uncommon when driving along the South Shore to have to stop for the cats to cross the street. There must have been 120 cats between those two houses. That's why she was the queer old cat lady from away. And the house was known not very affectionately by the town people of Southwest Harbor as the cat house. Well, after a little while, my ex-wife and I had a kid. And this kid, you know, we had a kid right there in Southwest Harbor. And one of my duties was to periodically report to the town planning board. So I met with the town planning board one night, and I went up to the chairman of the planning board. His name was Buzzy Beal. He owned the town lobster pound. And I said, Buzzy, I understand that my wife and I will always be that queer young couple from away. We're okay with that. But our daughter, Buzzy, she was born right here in Southwest Harbor. She was conceived in Maine. That makes her a Mainer, doesn't it? And Buzzy rubbed his chin and said, well, sir, if you can't crawl in the oven and had kittens, would you call them biscuits? Well, that's when I knew that my wife and I would never, not only would we never be that queer young couple from away, but our daughter would be that queer little girl from away, even though she was born right there in Southwest Alabama. Well, life went on, and LaRue and I got some wonderful things done. We built a park and did an inventory and all kinds of cool stuff. And then one day, the town manager walks into my office. He's got his arm loaded up with rolled up maps and stacks of paper. And he dumps them all on my desk. And he says, this just came from the federal government. I don't understand it. You figure it out. Well, it was the federal flood insurance program being rolled out for the very first time. And I spent days going through that pile of paper trying to understand it. And eventually I did understand it, and I found a way to sort of summarize it. If your house is on this side of the line, you're in the flood zone. And if you're in the flood zone, you can buy federal flood insurance. And if you don't, you give up your access to disaster relief. Full stop. Now, the program didn't stay that way, but that's the way it came out. Well, I thought, I went and explained it to the town manager, and he said, good, you go contact all those people in the flood zone and tell them. I did not want to do that, but I did. And I got two kinds of response. And I maybe talked to 200, 300 people. I got two kinds of response. Oh, good, I'm glad we have access to federal flood insurance. We need some kind of insurance since we're in the flood zone. Both of those people were very, just as nice as they could be. All the rest said, blah, 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 blah. The federal government's got its hand in my pocket again. Sorry. So, eventually I finished the assignment. I contacted all the people in the flood zone except one. That queer old cat lady from away. And I did not want to go talk to her. I was scared of her. But finally I worked up the nerve, and I went down to her house and stood on the rickety front porch, kind of worried I was going to fall through. And knock, knock, knock on the front door. She opened it and says, yes. And I said, by this time I knew her name. I said, Miss Cloos, can I come in and talk to you a little bit about a new federal program here in town? Yes, you may. So I went in, and she said, you sit here, and I'll be back. And she went off to get tea and cookies. Now, you cannot go in the front door of any house in Maine without getting tea and cookies. So I'm waiting for the tea and cookies to come back. All the blinds in the house are closed. It's dark in there except for a few dim bulbs, not counting me. And after a little while, she comes back with a plate of cookies and a cup of tea, and I very carefully and patiently explained the federal flood insurance program. And she said, well, that's quite interesting. Thank you so much. So I'm looking over her shoulder, and there's something on the wall that I think might be a Picasso. So I said, "Is that a Picasso?" And she said, "Yes, it is." And I said, "That's quite a beautiful print." And she said, "It's not a print, it's an original. Would you like to see it?" And I said, "Yes." So she went over and she rolled up the blind, which released a blizzard of dust motes. The room was completely full of dust. Roll up another blind, another blizzard of dust motes. Turned on a couple of lights. I turn around and here's an amazing Picasso. And I said, "Miss Cloos, would you mind telling me how you came to have a Picasso?" And she said, I wouldn't mind. I was his mistress." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Well, yes, I was for a little while. And then I took up with Matisse." And she said, and I said, "That's amazing." And she said, "Would you like to see the rest of my art?" Yes. So we went through that house one room at a time with her rolling the blinds up, releasing blizzards of dust. And we saw Matisses and Picassos and a Miro. We saw a Dali. She said Dali had been her mentor and she had shown her pictures in his gallery. It turned out she was Consuelo Cloos, one of the founders of abstract expressionism in New York City. A very famous, well, not that famous, but at once upon a time a famous abstract expressionist artist. She showed me several of her pictures. So we went all through the house, and I was just, oh man, what an experience. So eventually we finished, and I thanked her so much for sharing her pictures and stories of her life and her dust. And I went on my way. And after that, I tried several times to finagle another visit, but I couldn't. She never invited me back. And over the next few years while I was in Southwest Harbor, people would say, "There goes that queer old cat lady from away." And instead of saying, "No, you're wrong. That's Consuelo Cloos, the great abstract expressionist. She was once the mistress of Picasso." Instead, I said in my very best artificial Maine accent, "Yeah, that's her all right."